Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Court Johnson. I'm the VP of Growth at AtScale, and I'd like to welcome you all to AtScale's January office hours, and a warm welcome back to those who joined last month's session. This is a monthly series where we have a guest discuss topics pertaining to how AtScale helps organizations modernize their operational analytics. So just as a quick call out, please take note of AtScale's safe harbor statement. There may be some comments that touch on future functionality of the AtScale products, so just want to bring that to everyone's attention. And more importantly, I'd love to welcome our guest for today, Mike Haynes. He's a sales engineer here at AtScale. Mike's been in the analytics space for the better part of 2 decades at Hyperion, Oracle, MicroStrategy, and Salesforce. So we're excited about today's topic. We asked Mike here to join us today to talk about how AtScale can help organizations realize the promise of OLAP and how AtScale actually does that. So we're going to talk to some specific examples of how AtScale delivers on the promise of OLAP, including how AtScale can quickly port SQL Server Analysis Services cubes to AtScale's virtual cube so that companies can take or can scale their operational analytics. Welcome, Mike. And in today's session, we're going to have Mike touch on a recap of the history, promise, and limitations of OLAP through the eyes of somebody who's seen it emerge and mature. We're going to discuss and demonstrate how AtScale's virtual OLAP semantic layer removes the original constraints, as well as cover a few customer examples. And then we'll always finish with a few minutes of Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to type it into the questions section of the webinar, and we'll make sure to ask Mike at the end of today's talk. So Mike, thank you and welcome.
All right. Hey, thank everyone for joining today and taking time out to hear me talk about my last 20 plus years of experience with OLAP. And of course, as always, thank Court for organizing these things and suggesting the topic for this month. Great topic.
Absolutely. We're fired up to have you here, Mike. So let's start at the beginning. Remind us of what business intelligence was like before OLAP emerged, what problem OLAP was solving for, and what some of the immediate effects were.
It's a really great question. You know, when you go back to the old days, although I'm not that old, really you had essentially OLTP systems, online transactional processing systems, commonly referred to as source systems. And these source systems would either feed mainframes or ERPs, and generally speaking, you might get some reporting out of ERP, and you also had executive information systems. But ultimately, these are slow, they're rigid, they're expensive. They have very limited reporting functionality, and they can be fairly complex. When you think about an OLTP system and a report that you might get out of one of those systems, the online transactional processing, they're built precisely for that, transaction pricing, processing. So when I go to the Home Depot and I buy a 2x4 and I go to the cash register, I check that out, ultimately I end up with a receipt. That receipt has the date timestamp, it has what I bought, the SKU, how much it charged, maybe the store number, maybe a cashier number. That would be an example of a report out of an OLTP system. It's very fast in processing that, but it does not give me a lot of information. It's simply just a record. So you can imagine trying to get reporting out of systems like this where data was stored in silos, very difficult to get to the business language that people are speaking today with regards to all the various things that have been enabled by OLAP.
So it's fair to say that OLAP has had some stops and starts over the last 25 years. How has OLAP progressed since its inception? And what are some of the limitations you've seen that have hindered the efficacy of OLAP over that time period?
Yeah, another great question, something that's near and dear to my heart. I got my start in 1999 doing MOLAP, multidimensional OLAP. And prior to that, really, you could say the other fashion of OLAP that was out there was ROLAP, relational OLAP, whereas AtScale is a hybrid, and I'll get more into that later. But when you think about the ROLAPs and the MOLAPs of the world, essentially you're taking data out of those OLTP systems, you're moving them into data warehouses, you're defining star schemas, you're defining perhaps snowflakes, and then you're reporting on those schemas via SQL. And what happens along that process is ETL, and you get many different types of technologies, and it can be complex, and ultimately it gets slow. When you take a look at a MOLAP, you have an extra hop of the data. So generally speaking, you're looking at an ETL process from the OLTP system to a data warehouse. And then generally speaking, you're looking at another data hop out of that relational store into a MOLAP cube, or as commonly referred to, just a cube or an OLAP cube, if you will. So you've got more ETL. You're also defining measures and dimensions and every single combination within that cube. So you think of the analysis services of the world, or the SSAS of the world. They're calculating every single combination. And ultimately, you get data, you get performance degradation, just like you do in the OLAP world. And this was true even before big data became a popular term. This was true back in the late 90s, and it was certainly true in the early double aughts. Part of the problem with MOLAP is that you would end up with, as I said, a combination of every dimension and measure, and this results in data explosion. So that pre-processing time of your analysis services cube expands exponentially, and the size of your cube expands exponentially, and all of that results in a huge time delay, not only in getting the data to the end users, but ultimately in your query performance as well. And sadly, when you look at these cubes, and we did this at a customer down in Atlanta, where they actually did the performance, well, not the performance, but the reporting on how much of their cube was actually being reported upon. And they found that only 20%, 21% of the cube was actually being queried. But meanwhile, that 80% was giving them the complete overhead problems they had with 14 days to change the cube and 36 hours to calculate the cube to get performance that was steadily slowing down. So when we start to talk about the AtScale solution, I'll explain exactly how we solve for those issues.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mike. And just to summarize what you said, so OLAP was a big step forward for improving business user reporting and analytics, but there's still ways to go for it to realize its full potential. So maybe speak to a little bit about how AtScale helps organizations utilize OLAP in ways that more common technologies like SQL Server Analysis Services have not.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's pretty simple, really. You can think of AtScale as a hybrid approach to OLAP. We are a rollup backend in that we are submitting SQL, whether that's Impala or Spark or Hive on Tez or Google BigQuery or various dialects back to these data platforms, and we're presenting ourselves to the end user as a MOLAP. So that's really kind of the definition of a hybrid kind of player, a relational OLAP backend and a MOLAP front end. But what we do is we take it a step further. We're actually a virtual OLAP semantic layer as well. So I mentioned that 80-20 rule earlier, and the reason I did that is because when the customer down in Atlanta made this discovery that only 20% or so of their cube was actually being queried, it became apparent to me that our virtual capabilities are exactly what gets around all of their overhead. So with AtScale, you don't have any data explosion. So your processing is going to be much faster. You're not limited by the number of dimensions or the cardinality of those dimensions or the number of measures, because we are not going to store every single intersection based on measures and dimensions. What we will store on platform, it's another thing I forgot to mention, and I'll come back to that. What we're going to store on platform is the 20% that's actually being queried. Another thing that really helps in the big data world, as I mentioned in that second question, the data movements, you have OLTP to data warehouse, from data warehouse to OLAP cube, and then even a lot of times you had movement into the querying BI tool. Well, with AtScale and our hybrid model and our virtualness, if you will, we are only moving the data onto the big platform. Well, I should say you are only moving the data onto the big data platform. We are keeping our stored aggregates there. Our intelligence aggregates never move off your big data platform. So you're getting rid of a lot of complexity, and you're getting rid of the data explosion, which ultimately slows you down. And additionally, this is how we can do query responses in the seconds range and that speed of thought range that all of our end users over the last 30 years have become used to. And we can do that against hundreds of billions of records on a fact table that reside on whether it's a big data cluster or in the cloud or on-prem. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah, that's super helpful. But the one thing that I always say is seeing is believing. So maybe, Mike, we could pass it over to you and you could just give us a run through of a demo and see all this in action.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I would add is that in the past, right, one of the things I think that's another huge advancement in BI, at least in large part, maybe not completely across the board based on former OLAP type tools, but certainly a lot of them came with their own specific BI tool. So you were kind of siloed into whatever vendor you went to. Well, AtScale is not only agnostic on the data platform for the most part, we are also agnostic on the BI tool side of the house as well. So it's kind of that silver bullet that sits between both data and BI tool and still provides that OLAP experience that end users expect and the speed that they desire. And when I talk about OLAP, for those that might not be familiar, really, by the way, it stands for online analytical processing versus online transactional processing. So we're talking the language of business, if you will. And really what it means is we have dimensions. So I have the ability as a business user to look at sales or order quantity, buy a product, buy an order, buy a date, buy a customer, whatever buys I might need. It could be region, line of business, buy a salesperson, and you're not restricted. Those dimensions are also made up of hierarchies. So the end users can come in here, double click, and immediately start doing real world queries against data that resides on a big data platform, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, and get answers without having to know SQL, without having to write MDX, without having to move or extract data. Whether that's in this nice kind of outlier chart or whether it's just standard drill down, right? This is how business users define OLAP. Dimensions, measures, hierarchies that you can drill down across, get to the data you want. Now, the beauty of the AtScale solution is really our virtualness, if you will, with the ability to come in here and very quickly make changes and avoid those 14 days or those 36-hour reprocessing times. So if I were going to make a change historically in an analysis services cube, let's say I've got a change where I want to come in and I want to take my product info column, color, size, weight, style, and I want to add that to my model. By the way, this is the AtScale Design Center. I often say in most of my demos that a OLAP cube or an OLAP model never survives the first contact with an end user. And what I mean by that is they immediately want new attribution. They immediately want new dimensionality and metrics. Of course, if it takes 3 days or 10 days or 3 months, like it took our Yahoo founders to change this, that's not very interactive and you can't very easily cycle through that. I can come in here to this virtual cube and I can say, you know what? Let's add color as a new dimension. Color. We arrange this, it'll come into view. I've just added color as a new dimension. I can hit publish now, pick my environment, hit publish again. And if we come back to Tableau and we hit refresh, I now have color, right? This kind of change in historical analysis services or SBase and other MOLAP and ROLAP kinds of worlds would have taken easily weeks, if not months, because I would have had to have changed my ETL, updated my schemas, changed the ETL into the cube, dump the data out of the cube, make that same change in the cube, reload the cube, and then recalculate the cube. That is exactly what happens in analysis services world. That is exactly the life I lived back in the late 90s and early double aughts in the SBase world, also a MOLAP. And this is exactly the process all of our customers are coming to us to get away from because it's incredibly painful and it simply takes a lot of time and overhead. Oh, one more thing I wanted to share. Additionally, because we are agnostic to the front end and because we are a semantic layer, not only do we have the performance that you would expect on big data, but I can come in here and I'm actually going against a Hadoop platform right now, but it could very well be Redshift, Google BigQuery, etc. I can come in here to Excel across any one of the platforms that we support and very quickly do the exact same analysis. This is what end users love. And by the way, as I mentioned before, as a semantic layer, and I don't think you can downplay the value of a semantic layer when it comes to governance, I see color right there. This didn't exist before. I can do the exact same query now. Everyone's on the same sheet of music. Sales is calculated the same across every BI tool. Color is calculated the same. Order quantity, everything's the same. You have that one version of the truth as defined by your AtScale cube, or I should say your AtScale virtual OLAP semantic layer.
Yeah, that's really great to see, Mike. Thanks for running through that demo. And I think just being able to see the different BI tools that AtScale can connect with through the semantic layer, as well as the speaking to the different data platforms, is a really powerful story. Is every enterprise has a different configuration of that. And maybe just as a parallel to dive into that, I'll steal a little bit of thunder from the Q&A here, but I was thinking maybe we could talk through a couple of existing customer use cases. And one area where we've seen a lot of traction is in helping insurance providers with per member per month calculations. Could you maybe elaborate on that use case and what we've done with customers to help them through transitioning off analysis services and being able to run these types of use cases specifically?
Yeah, 100%, Court. This is a great example, per member per month. Generally speaking here, we're talking about a multi-fact model that has different levels of granularity that needs to be calculated differently across many dimensions that may be related or unrelated. And in fact, we have a number of customers that I worked with early on over the last 4 years here in Connecticut, insurance companies that couldn't solve the PMPM calculation through a plethora of different technologies. We had one customer in particular up in Hartford that was running on Teradata. They were pushing that data out into analysis services, and then they were pushing even more of that out into Tableau. And in Tableau, they were trying to do line of detail, level of detail, and to actually calculate this. And of course, as they grew in size with big data, it just got worse and worse and worse. We were 100% able to take them off of analysis services and actually put the PMPM calculation solely within AtScale so that they no longer had to do Tableau data extracts and query side calculations in order to kind of complete this PMPM picture that they were doing, which actually started back with the ETL through Teradata, ETL into SAS, and then extracts. All along the step, they're changing the process to try to get to this end nirvana of per member per month. And now, essentially, they not only reduce their spend on Teradata by putting their data onto a big data platform, but now they're keeping those calculations within AtScale. It's actually a great story. We have multiple insurance companies that are doing that.
Yeah, and maybe just elaborating outside of the insurance use case, another example, this time focused on retail organizations. So we've seen a few different use cases from our customers in retail. Can you speak to one or two of those in terms of, the limitations of analysis services and needing to leverage the AtScale virtual OLAP solution in order to solve those problems?
100%. We have a do-it-yourselfer type retailer, Fortune 50 down in Atlanta that came on board. One of my first proof of concepts, actually, one of our very first customers. And that entire process that I talked about during not only the questions that Court was asking, but during the demo of ETL, they were on Teradata, ETLing data onto Teradata, into analysis services. They had many analysis services cubes because they had to be broken up. And then, of course, it was going out to not only suppliers and vendors, but their internal stakeholders as well. And that process took them 14 days at least to make any changes. And one of the cubes took at least 36 hours to calculate. So you can imagine that you're getting data that's at least 36 hours old, and changes take 2 weeks. And it was just kind of not working for them, and it was only getting worse as the data grew. So not only did they want to get out of that pain of removing the 14 days and 36 hours, but they also wanted to reduce their spend on Teradata. So they invited AtScale in to do that, and that's exactly what we did. One of the issues they had with analysis services was when you think about the size of the cubes and the amount of dimensions and how it begins to exponentially increase these processing times. In order to do year-over-year calculations, they had to have one cube, I should say quarter-over-quarter. They had a cube per quarter. So if they wanted to do 2 years, they had to have 8 cubes just to do year-over-year. And you can imagine if you want to do 3, 4, 5, etc., or just as data size itself grows, you just start adding more and more cubes and more time. And we would be able to take all of that away, put it all into an AtScale cube, and just run with it. And so far, they've been fantastically happy. Right? They were a customer back at the very beginning of 2016.
Yeah, that's another great use case to highlight. One other thing to think about is just this evolution of the OLAP space in general. Maybe speak to some of the future capabilities that you would expect for companies to want or be able to adopt in order to get even more value out of their data.
Yeah, another great question. It's interesting. As I mentioned, I've been here for about 3.5, almost 4 years now. And when I first came on board, nonstop, still to this day, the questions that I would get, this is great that you can go against Hortonworks. It's great that you can do Cloudera, MapR. We love that you're going to the cloud with Google BigQuery, with Redshift, et cetera, but when can I also go against Oracle? I've got some data that I don't want to move out of Oracle. I've got some data that I don't want to move out of Teradata, out of Netezza. Pick your appliance, whatever it is. But I do want to reduce my spend, and I don't want to do any more future development on them. How can I do that? And that's exactly where we're moving towards with our virtual cubes and the ability to federate queries out of them across all the various databases that our customers are dealing with, whether that's a big data platform or a Teradata, an Oracle, or a Snowflake, what have you, Redshift, et cetera. And that's a pretty exciting future because it's a question, as I mentioned, that everybody's been asking since the beginning. And of course, we're always going to continue developing our OLAP capabilities with our advanced calculations, which really is what defines any kind of OLAP virtual semantic layer, right? The ability to do those hardcore calculations like PMPM and multi-level metrics, et cetera.
Yeah, that's really great, Mike. And just elaborate on what you said. A lot of folks are asking about on the chat just what platforms we support and BI tools. So we'll follow up offline on that after this to answer any specific questions around specific data architectures. So, well, I know we're coming up on the half hour. So Mike, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to email us, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have specifically. With that, I would say stay tuned for our February office hours, which we'll be announcing shortly, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks so much.